Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 2 of Thane Brain, an unscripted podcast where I discuss the inner machinations of my mind. I really do want these episodes to be standalone, going into one particular topic, but this is very much a continuation of my personal mental health journey, so I really do recommend listening to that first episode if you want a deep dive explanation of OCD, what that's meant for me specifically, and how it's just generally misunderstood by the public. So, building on top of that, I really wanted to get into the crux of when I started suspecting that there was something else going on with me. I think there's very little that's good about obsessive-compulsive disorder, but I think I really did fall back on it as sort of this scapegoat. In high school, I had the official OCD, PTSD, general anxiety, and major depressive disorder, sort of explaining all of the symptoms of what I was experiencing. Anything bad in my life, I could point to that and say, this is it. And that conclusive thinking, I think, really closed me off of the possibility that it could be more complicated than I initially thought. So I am now going to build to this main event, this key point of interest, the main motivator that made me seek out professional help again. So in middle and high school, I worked with various therapists to what I would say is little success, unfortunately. I didn't find one that clicked with me, and at the time, I was taking the highest dose of a medication that wasn't really compatible with my body, and I also had these trial periods with all different sorts of medications, and it's rough. Right, I don't think I was ready for it. The medication that I was on the longest for, citalopram, I just had a bad reaction to it. I don't like how I acted during that time. I just really regret that period of my life. And I don't mean to discourage anyone from taking medication because I am on one now that really works for me. But this is just providing context for why it took me so long to try again. And it wasn't really by choice. It was inevitable. I lived that long without medication, but it was not without struggle. That was a decade of my life where I was really just hanging in there. I just thought, I can do this. I was able to function. I was stable enough. I was no longer suicidal, and therefore I just kind of soldiered on. Unfortunately, and this is really sad for me to reflect on and say, but I was miserable for a lot of those 10 years. But what got me into therapy again, what got me to try taking medication and to further explore why I'm having such a hard time, that would be insomnia. Insomnia cornered me. It came up, it beat me down. This was the result of trying to essentially brute force my way through life. And now my body was about to pay the price. Like mentally I was suffering, but now physically I was about to have these problems that could not be ignored. Sleep deprivation is no joke, and I'm sure many of you probably feel like you're running on empty. I'm sure a lot of you listening can relate to sleeplessness. How many people actually get the full 8 hours of sleep recommended each night? I'm willing to wager not many, because we live in a world that values productivity more than anything. Now, I've always had a weird relationship with sleep. Let me take you back to my high school years again. I was very much a night owl. I came alive at night, and this stems from the fact that I am heavily introverted. I remember the first time in high school for a college and career choices class, I had to take that Myers-Briggs personality test, and before I knew what the word introverted meant, I tested 100%. And when I called the teacher over to explain the results, she just looked at that and laughed. But really, it's not that I don't need people or anything, I'm just very much okay with being alone. In fact, that's how I get a lot of my energy. I need quiet time to recharge myself. And nighttime was the perfect opportunity for that. And that could be a good thing. But I really just went about it the wrong way. I started neglecting my responsibilities. I stopped caring about school. I would not do my homework or half-ass it and just stay up all hours of the night, which did not bode well for my performance. And I had a part-time job before this as a dishwasher at a pizza joint, but really my first 5 days a week job was as a produce clerk at a grocery store. And when I was hired, they were actually looking for somebody to start this new overnight position. So it would still be in the produce department, but it'd essentially be a one-man show where I'm prepping everything for the day to come. And so I looked at that and I said, yes, that's what I want to do. That's perfect for me. I don't have to deal with customers. I can just focus on my work alone. And I actually really did enjoy the job. It was not bad. But I started running into problems when I had great difficulty showing up on time. Now, it's one thing to stay up for fun, but having a hard set schedule that you have to adhere to, in this case it was 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., that takes a lot of self-discipline. And I just did not have it at the time. And people say, oh, you have the whole day. Like, you gain a lot of time. When the reality of it is I have to sleep just like the rest of you. I would go home and I didn't want to sleep right away. And I would start getting drowsy close to the late afternoon, evening, and just start sleeping into the shift. And I couldn't have that. I was embarrassed. My boss at the time was actually very understanding of the situation. He felt for how hard it must have been, but I just could not have that. So I experimented. I tried 4 a.m. to 12 p.m. instead. And these weird hours just didn't wind up working out for me like I thought they would. So I stopped. But during that time, I had discovered melatonin supplements. And I sort of formed a dependency on them. Right? And I didn't think much of it. It is a supplement that our body naturally produces. People I would speak with, when I would mention that I had trouble sleeping, would suggest melatonin. It's this widely available product that's sold over the counter. So I just started taking them daily, like the high amount ones, 5, 10 milligrams. I wasn't taking this thinking about any future repercussions, right? And some bottles of melatonin that you can buy don't even really go into detail about how you're supposed to take them. Ideally, with melatonin supplements, you want to take a break from them so you don't develop a dependency. And I just wasn't really aware of that until several years later. When I just happened to be bored, like reading the back of this particular brand of melatonin that I bought, and then I started panicking. And I started to wean down. I was on 1 milligram. I'm still taking 1 milligram nightly. But anyway, leading up to that, right, I had no trouble sleeping at night. Oh, maybe it's not a good thing that I'm taking melatonin this regularly, but it didn't affect my sleep much. I would say that more or less, I got the same amount as most other people every night. And yes, some nights were worse than others, where it'd be really hard for me to fall asleep, but everyone experiences that. And there were certain circumstances, there are certain cases of situational anxiety that it would be harder for me to start dozing off. And the problem was always falling asleep, never staying asleep, because my mind was just constantly racing. And back then I didn't suspect ADHD at all. But I'm going through life sleeping decently, having these rare instances where it's hard for me to fall asleep, and then suddenly it happens, right? What I would consider to be true insomnia. So we had our biannual photography training. That's biannual as in 2 times a year, not once every 2 years. Twice yearly we'd have this photography training, and it was always a stressful time for me. Not because I'm being judged, I am not the one being trained, I am the trainer. I have to be on to answer questions. I have to appear a certain way for these new hires coming in and learning the ropes. I had my routine that was being disrupted because, now there's all these new people that you have to meet. So that was a point of heightened anxiety, and I knew this. But a few years ago, on one particular training day, nothing special about it. It was just another training day that I was not looking forward to. I did my normal nighttime routine, got into bed, and nothing. I could not sleep a wink that night. I was tired. I desperately wanted to sleep, but I could not. And it's not that I haven't pulled all-nighters before this, but the difference is that was intentional. I was doing that for fun, or to be productive, to work on something. I had made the decision of, I am going to stay awake so I can do blank. But this time, my only goal was to sleep. That is all I wanted. It was a disconnect between my mind and my body. My body demanded sleep, but my mind was racing, and it just wouldn't shut up. And more than ever, I just wanted an off switch that I could turn my brain off. And I still want that. That'd be incredible. But we're not robots. We're human. We have complicated brains. And so I could not get there. And the fact that I could not get to sleep that night, the fact that it happened once, where involuntarily I was kept awake the entire night, that set a precedent. That told my brain, okay, well, it did happen once, so it can happen again. In the obsessive way that my brain works, it latched onto that. And I developed a sort of performance anxiety when it came to sleep. The nervousness would come up, the anticipation. Oh, it's going to be a repeat. I'm going to be exhausted tomorrow because I won't be able to sleep. It just fuels this horrible cycle. And I was miserable. That lasted for many, many months, where I would get inconsistent sleep and I was just taking what I could get. I was truly surviving there for a while. There's a lot of tired people out there. You're probably a tired person yourself. Again, I think, unfortunately, sleep deprivation is very common. But if you pull a real all-nighter, no naps, no anything, the next day will truly be terrible. And it's not even just the next day. There's this concept of sleep debt, where you skip a night's sleep. You can't just get the recommended 8 hours the next night and be fine. No, because you'll be 8 hours behind still. So you're dragging for several days, and that's just one bad night's sleep. Imagine that compounding. And I just felt like a zombie, truly. It was so hard to just function normally. I couldn't think right. I had brain fog constantly. Low energy, all of that multiplied. And so obviously that lit a fire underneath me. You cannot live like that. I had to figure out a solution, and I had to figure one out fast. I was calling doctors left and right, and I didn't have a primary care physician at that point. I wasn't on health insurance. My work didn't offer it for my position at the time. I was calling around, explaining my situation, asking, who can help me? And I just remember I would call these clinics. I would speak to the receptionist, and they would say, based on what you described to me, your symptoms, you need to go to the ER right now. Like, you need to go to the emergency room. And I thought, yeah, that's a short-term solution. Like, maybe they'll give me some kind of sleeping pill, but I didn't want that. I need to think in the long term. And I finally found a sleep specialist. I explained what was going on, what my concerns were. Here's my history taking melatonin. I'm worried about it, but it's worked for me in the past. Why is it not working anymore right now? And that proved to be very unhelpful, because I went in there and she was convinced, this doctor was convinced that I was simply seeking out sleeping drugs. Like, I wanted something that would knock me out quickly. I simply could not understand that. I'm like, I filled out all this intake paperwork. I explained in detail what my goals were, clearly spelling it out. So I don't think she read it. But there is one positive thing that came from that encounter, and it was the fact that that entire conversation boiled down to her saying, I can't help you. I'm not a psychologist. To my mind, it's like, okay, of course, that makes all the sense in the world. This is a matter of psychology. This is in my head. My brain is not relaxing enough to allow me to fall asleep. And if all these people are saying, you need emergency care right now, you need to be on these sleeping pills, I just thought, well, I guess now is the time to try medication again to treat anxiety, because that's the core of it. And I knew in some way that OCD was related. That was a major source of anxiety for me. So I took that knowledge, and finally I found a primary care doctor. I told him everything that was going on, and I explained my hesitation, my wariness of getting on a medication. I said, I know it's probably necessary, however, here are my concerns, and he was really cool about it. He worked with me and said, okay, we can put you on some of these other supplements. You can try these out. So for a while I was taking GABA, G-A-B-A, 5-HTP, and magnesium glycinate, and that seemed to do the trick for a little while. Before I met with a doctor, I was trying all sorts of things, like I would not use screens in the evening. Before bed, I would wear blue blocking glasses, turn down the brightness on all my devices. I would exercise first thing in the morning, get some sunshine to keep my circadian rhythm in check. I would even do home remedies that people recommended. Of course, the chamomile tea, but also a cup of warm milk, almonds, kiwi, red tart cherry juice, and nothing really worked. So I tried these supplements the doctor recommended. I don't know how much of it was placebo, and even if it was, that's fine. I needed something to trick my brain into actually just falling asleep. But whatever the case, nevertheless, this was kind of a band-aid solution. And so my doctor and I explored more options. He recommended therapy again. I started seeing one. It was alright, kind of just more of the same. And all the while this was happening, I just couldn't get it out of my head that OCD had something to do with this. So I went back to the books. I kept reading about the point of OCD, the causation, the amygdala. But it was all things that I had heard before, and it just seemed like there was another piece that I just wasn't grasping. And then finally, I found this link, and I was really skeptical, of course, about websites. I took a class on information literacy in the internet, but I found this site, Misdiagnosis Monday on Neurodivergent Insights, and it is a .com, but I'm browsing the web thinking about OCD, and I find this chart, this Venn diagram that has one circle of OCD and then two other circles that interlap. One of them is ADHD, and finally, autism. And I'm looking at this Venn diagram where they intersect, seeing the similarities, okay? And of course, I'm looking at this time. This was, 2 years ago. I have this interpretation in my head of what ADHD and autism are, and they're misinformed. I didn't look into ADHD much because I thought I knew what it was. And this goes back to people generalizing OCD. So I had this stereotype that, someone with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, they can't focus, right? Not understanding that it just simply isn't true. Of course they can focus. They can really focus. So I'm looking at the ADHD section. It's like, oh, wow, I do a lot of that stuff. I look at the autism side. I think, oh, wow, that is fascinating. We're like kindred spirits. Having OCD, it's like they understand. Oh, we do these things for different reasons, but we do them nevertheless. And then I take a look at the middle section and where they all overlap, and I start going, oh, wow. I relate to just everything here, don't I? And my mind was blown. Here this was just blowing open the door of what I thought ADHD and autism were. And still, this is not, in and of itself, this is not enough to change my mind. This, of course, will not convince me. I'm a very skeptical person. I like to see all the facts. I like to really ruminate on things before I come to a decision. So I'm looking at this, and it's just like curiosities. It's just, this is interesting, not this is helpful, right? And let me tell you why that is. So with autism in particular, I went to school in a very small town. This was a tiny, tiny school, especially compared to Arizona, where you have these massive campuses, huge graduating classes. But in my school, it was so small, everybody knew each other. And in my grade range, we had a couple of students. They were brothers of a dear friend of mine. And as far as I knew, they both had autism. And they were high support needs, nonverbal, right? So in my mind, that was my only exposure that I knew of autism. That is how it presents. That is what it is. I mean, I was ignorant. Come to find out, only one of them actually had autism, and both had developmental delays. So it was a lot of things. So what happened from that point on, I did have a couple of online friends, one in particular, who identified strongly with ADHD. It was not, I don't want to say a part of their personality, but it was right there in their bio. And this person to me is like a pen pal. We go back and forth on ideas, we've collaborated on projects. And I say pen pal because we really take our time responding to each other. There were a lot of things she said about how her brain works that I was like, oh yeah, I do that too. But as far as we both knew, I only had OCD. I specifically remember her saying things like, oh, I didn't know people with OCD do blank. When it turns out that's not an OCD-specific thing, it is ADHD. And it was from this person that I learned the term neurodivergence. And again, here is another example of the correlation, the connection between these conditions. So I'm mulling this over in my brain, and in the meantime, I just happened to join the autism subreddit. I thought, here I am connecting with this person who has ADHD. Let me see this broader corner of the internet where people are sharing their experiences with autism. And I try not to spend a lot of time on social media, but I do browse Reddit every now and again. And so occasionally I'll stumble across a post. It's always just these highly relatable things. I start learning terms that I wasn't familiar with before, like safe foods, for example. Here is this word that the autism community uses to describe why a person might eat the same thing for every meal again and again. I personally have been eating almonds with dried cereal for breakfast every day for years. And for lunch, a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. These aspects I just thought, were a me thing. But again, the skeptic in me would always push back. Like, okay, you're relating a lot to these posts. Well, that doesn't mean you have autism. But eventually it did catch up to me. It was a slow burn. And it took probably about a year for me. And I just got more interested in learning about autism as a whole, and so I picked up a couple of books on the subject. I started listening to podcasts and YouTubers who had autism and were open about their experiences. So this just all sort of culminated. It was a very slow burn, I would say, over the course of a year. And finally, I hit a point where I was able to tell myself, okay, that is a hell of a lot of coincidences. Why is it that I am so engaged that I can relate so heavily to the experiences of these people? And every time I reflect on my past, it explained a lot of little quirks about me that I just chalked up to me being weird, right? I was called weird my whole life. I was used to it. I had a different way of seeing the world. I was very imaginative. I would create my own worlds. Why have I always struggled so hard to communicate my emotions, my feelings? Then there were little things in my life that I picked up on and just kind of shrugged off. Like my photography manager at the time, who was a very good friend. She had noticed that when I am really trying to listen to somebody and formulate a response, I'm not making eye contact with them. And that's because it helps me focus. Eye contact always made me uncomfortable. And as an adult, it's like a bad habit. I always pull my hair out. I'm constantly balancing my leg. I'm rocking back and forth. I'm tapping things repeatedly as if I'm playing piano. Oh, stimming is a word for repeated physical behavior. And I know everybody stims. I'm aware of that. There's a certain intensity and frequency to mine that I would have to hide from others and then come out with in private. And then, this thing called echolalia, where you repeat words and phrases. There are things that I say again and again and again. These eccentricities that I would exhibit in my private life. Because I'm able to suppress these things when I'm out in public. I'm able to mask myself, which I always called my customer service face. I made the mask analogy before I knew that was another autistic community term. Masking. It is hiding your neurodivergent traits. I've always felt like that I'm pretending to be someone else. There's all these rules that I don't understand and can't get behind, but I've learned to adapt over time. And I've done quite well at it, but could this be a reason for the exhaustion? And I always feel bad saying this, but I want you to understand the severity of it. The COVID-19 pandemic, the shutdown of 2020, where we were all stuck at home alone. We could not go out in public, and when we had to shop for groceries, for example, there were heavy restrictions. You were discouraged from spending in-person time with others. And to many, this was a huge detriment. This was devastating. And I can feel for you. I can understand why that is so hard for the average person. But for me, the shutdown was the happiest I'd ever been in my adult life. And I'm not exaggerating to make a point. Genuinely, I miss that time. Because if you look at it from my perspective, here I am, this highly introverted person who has a lot of social anxiety. I'm a person who wants to work full time on their YouTube videos. That is my passion. That is my one goal. The thing I want more than anything else. And this gave me the opportunity to live that life. I was the eccentric hermit. I wrote more. I created and produced more things. Was that period of time where we were stuck indoors, and I was still taking care of myself. I was exercising. I was going for walks. I was playing Ring Fit Adventure. So it was a lovely time for me. And that's not to take away from anyone's experiences, just for me personally, that was the best time of my life. And it gave me a respite from the daily grind. This 9-to-5 job that is so utterly exhausting. It takes up all of my energy. I just constantly on a day-to-day, it feels like survival. Well, now I didn't have to do that. I could just create. I could make things. I could be an artist. I could do what I wanted. And it's like, yeah, there's nothing stopping me from doing that now, and I'm still always creating. But free time is this precious resource that we just don't have a lot of access to as adults who work your typical job. Like, my day job is not my passion, and it takes so much energy from me so that I can perform well at it, because little did I know, I'm masking my neurodivergent traits. I am out in the field, I am photographing, I am putting on this friendly face, which I called my clown makeup, because it's like the sad clown paradox, smiling depression. That whole idea. I'm just doing that constantly, I'm exerting myself, I'm putting my energy into something that, let's be real, I need an avenue of steady income. So that's the purpose there. And my personal life is suffering because my happiness, my personal life has plummeted. At that point, I was picking up on all of this terminology. I was learning these new things, hearing about this wide array of experiences from people on the autistic spectrum. And it was producing a lot of answers for questions I've always had, but wasn't prioritizing finding an answer for. And it is at this juncture that I decided, okay, perhaps I should take an assessment. I wasn't expecting much. I just figured, let me just go online and I'll take whichever test people are saying is the most accurate assessment for autism. And of course, this was just to kind of get an idea of where I was at. I talked about being skeptical before, but I was highly suspicious of any online test being this quote-unquote proof. So really, this was just a starting point, and I always knew that. So I went in with very low expectations. I took a couple. There was the AQ and EQ. And lo and behold, I scored in the range for someone who is suspected to have significant autism traits. So it's just me looking at my screen, and the wheel is spinning. It's one thing for me to have this introspective sort of conversation with myself. For me to see and hear from others, and then say, oh yes, I can relate to this for blank reason. But it's another thing to really objectively take this test, designed to give you an idea of whether or not you should seek out an assessment, and for that score to be this high. Me being the person that I am, I took these tests a second time. I'm like, okay, now I'm really going to lock in. I was already answering honestly before, but let me just doubly make sure that I'm doing this correctly and that I'm not misinterpreting any of the questions. The results come back. I scored highly. Okay, well, what else we got? Luckily, there are a whole slew of different autism tests out there, including the ASPE quiz, CAT-Q, RBQ-2A, RADS-R, RAADS-R, all of which I was scoring highly on. They all told me that, yes, this is something worth looking into. I took these tests on different websites, compiled all the results together. In this phase of my life, suddenly autism started taking over. And of course, I've had this before, where I'm highly invested in one particular thing, and usually that is a certain video game. I will be obsessed. I will just be encapsulated, utterly drawn in, smitten by one game at a time. And I'll cycle through a few. For me, it's Paper Mario, Earthbound, Zelda Majora's Mask. These games ebb and flow. It's mainly these three games in particular that come in and out of my life. And yes, I'd be so invested in a particular topic that I'll go hours and hours and hours without doing anything but researching or video editing related to that topic. I would make tea for myself, have the water boiling, I would take the tea kettle, pour in the hot tea, let the tea bag steep, and I would then proceed to forget about it. And my wife would come home from work, and she'd say, what is this tea bag doing there? Oh, it's just been sitting out for a few hours. That kind of thing happened constantly. I didn't know it was a neurodivergent thing. I thought I was just forgetful. But really, autism itself, the concept of autism, me having it became a hyperfixation. And so I searched for the 3 most reputable recommended books about autism that have been published. I got those, read them, and I started putting together this document where I included as attachments my scores, but then really went through my entire medical history and my life. I got in touch with my brother, who is an expert in genealogy. Ever since the creation of websites like Ancestry.com, he has dedicated a large portion of his free time to studying our family's lineage, and he's created this incredibly expansive family tree with deep, deep roots. And so, with his help, we compiled a family medical history with focus on immediate family. I didn't tell my mother at the time that I had suspected autism, but I also knew that she had access to my baby book, which really went into a lot of detail about the first 5 years of my life. And so I got her on the phone and we had a long conversation where I was transcribing everything that she had written down in that thing. So that became another few pages of this extensive document I was writing. Since I was becoming more knowledgeable about autism, anytime I would read something and relate to it and connect to it, have a story of something in my past that best explains that particular thing, I would write it down. I got a list of all my stims and their frequency. I had even reached out to that friend I had mentioned previously in the episode, and they did me the kindness of giving their perspective while also asking their parents who raised a child with autism if they noticed anything in me, without saying that I was personally seeking out an assessment. And here was an account from them and their parents, along with anyone else that knew me as a child and could have something to say on the matter. I approached my aunt, who spent a lot of time with me back then, and I asked for any peculiarities she noticed, and there were a lot of them. So this was building and building, and I had this giant report, what I call my suspected autism journey. And I don't know collectively how many pages it wound up being, but this big resource, in addition to all the other supplemental stuff that I had written, it totaled about 30,000 words. So I had basically written a book about why I think I have autism. That was the length it took me to convince myself that this is worth seeking out, because in my research I realized an adult autism evaluation, that is expensive. And I really didn't have the money to afford it. I couldn't justify it. Like, how am I going to spend thousands of dollars if I'm not ready to explain my case? So I did all this prep work just on my own, and then the hunt began for someone who could assess me. And let me tell you, this part of the process was very difficult. I actually first just went to my primary care doctor, and he said, yes, autism can present in many different ways, so I think it could benefit you to look into this. Let me refer you to this clinic I know. And I was put on a waiting list, but I was really determined to get in there. So I sent a number of emails, and they matched me with a physician assistant there who is neurodivergent herself. And I put out everything on the table. We had several meetings. I explained the suspected autism and ADHD. And while she was able to diagnose the ADHD, she recognized it in me after an interview and several questionnaires. But she could not, nor could anyone else at this clinic, officially diagnose somebody with autism. I would need a licensed psychologist for that. What's more, I was essentially on my own. She provided advice. She told me to look at local places and cross-check my insurance to see that they're in network and just go down the list. And that's exactly what I did. I created a spreadsheet where I was writing down all these doctors' names, calling them one by one, seeing if anyone could do an adult assessment for autism. And the answer, most of the time, was no. And if it wasn't no, then it was again the thousands of dollars. And on top of that, I was new to the world of insurance, so trying to navigate it was very challenging. In addition to calling these doctors, I was on the phone with my insurance clarifying how things would work. And ultimately, it just seemed to lead to more confusion. So thankfully, finally, I found this place, this psychological services center, that did do adult assessments. They were on the cheaper side comparatively. It was still $1,000. And they did take insurance. However, that was another point of contention. I actually had to cancel. I said, I'm not going to be able to do this because technically they were out of network and I would have to clear another very high deductible outside of my standard one. It was a mess. Long story short, she worked with me. I actually saw the postdoctoral fellow of the main lead doctor. And in doing so, they offered me a discount. So I paid a total of $500, which is the price I would have paid had I cleared the insurance deductible. I agreed. I said, let's do this. There were mountains of intake paperwork. That took a long time. Several days to complete. But I got all that done. I sent off the documents that I had created myself. Then it was time to meet her. So we had an in-person interview. They told me to pack a lunch. I had more tests to take there. Some I did on my own in a separate room, some in her presence. There were some things I had to do on the computer. It was a whole thing. There were some follow-up exchanges, and after a nervous couple of weeks, it was finally time for the evaluation appointment. I was going to get the results, and she did determine that I was on the autism spectrum. So all of this preparation, all of this time ruminating, doubting myself, I finally had a professional telling me, yes, I have assessed you and I see what you're seeing. For me, it was just a relief. Like, here I am at 30 years old. I've had these difficulties for as long as I can remember, and I wasn't looking at it in the right way. I didn't know. None of us knew, because a lot of what we know about autism compared to 20, 30 years ago is substantial. We're learning so much more. There are more resources available. There's a greater understanding. So for me, it was a relief to finally hear, oh, this is, yes, the OCD is prominent within you. The OCD can account for a lot, but here's the greater picture. Finally, here is what you were missing this whole time. And it was just a relief to hear that. But I think I'm going to stop things there. Really, I wanted this one to be the awakening, I guess, for lack of a better term. We'll see where the next one takes us, but I really, I know I didn't really specifically talk a whole lot about autism and ADHD in detail, but I thought it was necessary to explain how I got here. Go through this journey and help explain how I came to understand myself. I hope you'll stick around for the next one. We can look at what this means moving forward, how I plan to live the rest of my life as an autistic adult.